the reason that we have the cognitive dissonance where we tend not to think of affirmative action as systemic racism is because we've corrupted our idea of both racism and justice to include something about oppression or about negative results, right? But that's not always the case. When we're saying that something is systemic, whether it's injustice or racism or sexism or whatever you want to throw in there, to say that something is systemic is to say that there is a law, if we're talking about the government, or that there's a policy or a person of power or people of power in that system who are implementing policies that have the feature that we're talking about, right? So if it's systemic injustice, then we're talking about unequal weights and measures, treating people unequally by policy, right? If we're talking about racism, then we're talking about a law, a policy, or a person of power which specifies some things for one race over against other races, or vice versa, right? Where it's partial towards people based on their race. That's what racism is. It's prejudice or partiality based on race. And so that's why I think you're right to say Jim Crow and slavery are very good examples of systemic racism, where you've got a law or a policy that is partial toward people based on their race. An example of that today would be affirmative action, right? And the reason that we have the cognitive dissonance where we tend not to think of affirmative action as systemic racism is because we've corrupted our idea of both racism and justice to include something about oppression, or about negative results, right? So we think that racism is a bad thing, and therefore it only exists when there's observable negative results for the group that you're being racist against. And so it's hard for us to think, or something with injustice. Injustice is a bad thing, and therefore injustice only exists when there's observable, obvious negative results for the people who are supposedly experiencing the injustice. But that's not always the case. So let's say that you're a millionaire and I'm dirt poor, and I borrow $1,000 from you and pledge to pay you back, but then I never pay you back. I've committed an injustice against you, whether you suffered significantly for it or not, right? And it's really important to get this, because this is essential to understanding the way in which we've committed an injustice against God. And it's essential for understanding the sense of injustice that God has against us, which warrants him punishing us for eternity in hell, right? Because when we sin, we commit an injustice against God, but it doesn't hurt him. He's not up in heaven suffering as a result of us committing an injustice against him. But that doesn't mean that our injustice against him is any less significant, or that we are any less deserving of his just wrath against us, right? So this is really important. The fact that the victim of injustice doesn't happen to suffer, or you could say the victim of racism doesn't happen to suffer in a significant or obvious way, doesn't make it not racism or not injustice. The essence of the racism or the essence of the injustice is on the front end, in the nature of the action, not in the result or the consequences.